When wishes come true. Subal Chandra's son was called Sushil Chandra, but people always aren't true to their names. Which is why perhaps Subal, whose name means the strong one, was actually quite weak, and Sushil, which means gentle and quiet, was just the opposite. The son Sushil drove the entire neighborhood mad with his antics, and this made his father itch to punish him. Unfortunately, the father suffered from rheumatism while the son could run like a deer, so most of the intended slaps missed their target. But on the rare occasions when his father managed to catch him, Sushil really had a bad time. The day on which this story begins was a Saturday, and school would be over by 2 in the afternoon. But Sushil was in no mood to go to school for a number of reasons. To start with, it was the day of the dreaded geography test. Secondly, there was to be a display of fireworks at the Boses that evening, which everyone was looking forward to. After thinking long and hard about it, Sushil jumped into bed just when it was time to go to school. Subal looked at him in surprise and asked him, "Why are you still in bed? Aren't you going to school?" "I've a terrible stomachache," said Sushil promptly. "I can't go to school today." Subal saw through the trick at once and said to himself, "Very well. I know how to teach you a lesson." Subal locked his son in and went off to prepare a really bitter brew. Sushil was in a quandary. He was dying to go to the Boses, but now there seemed to be no chance. When Subal returned to the room with the big bowl of bitter brew, Sushil jumped out of bed saying, "I am fine now. My stomach ache is gone. I am going to school." "You are not going out anywhere today," said Subal. "Drink this and lie here quietly for the rest of the day." He forced the brew down Sushil's reluctant throat, locked the door from outside and left. Sushil burst into tears and wept buckets the whole day long. He told himself over and over again, "If only I could be as old as my father, I'd be able to do whatever I want to, and no one will be able to lock me in like this." Subal sat outside and thought, "My parents pampered me so much when I was young that I could never study as much as I ought to have done. If only I could be young once again, I wouldn't waste a single minute playing. I would spend all my time studying hard." It so happened that the goddess who grants wishes was passing by just then. She heard both Sushil and Subal and decided to grant them their wishes. Appearing before Subal, she said, "Tomorrow morning you will be as young as your son." To Sushil she said, "From tomorrow you are going to be as old as your father." Both father and son was delighted. Usually, old Subal could never get any sleep in the early part of the night, but fell in deep sleep towards dawn and slept late. But when the sun rose the next morning, he almost jumped out of bed and discovered that he had grown quite small. Sushil Chandra normally woke up at the crack of dawn and ran about the house. But this morning he was hardly able to open his eyes. When finally he did succeed in shaking off his sleep, it was only because his father was making such a racket outside. Sushil woke up to find that his clothes were bursting at the seams. His body has become strangely bloated. Both father and son got exactly what they wished for. What they had not anticipated were the complications. In the past, Sushil had always thought that once he was old like his father and independent like him, he'd spend his entire time climbing trees, swimming in the pond, eating raw mangoes, looking for birds' nests, and roaming with his friends all day long. When he woke up that morning, he felt no urge whatsoever to climb trees. He looked at the pond covered with water hyacinths and felt quite certain that he'd run a temperature if he dared to take a dip in it. Finally, he stood up and decided to try his usual antics. He went to a nearby olive tree and made several attempts to climb it. He was astounded to find that climbing was beyond him now. Wasn't it just yesterday that he had been up there as easily and effortlessly as a squirrel? After several attempts, he hung on to one of the lower branches, which gave way under his weight and broke into two. He lay flat on the ground. People passing by were amazed to see an old man trying to climb a tree, and when they saw him rolling on the ground, they burst out laughing. Poor Sushil hung down his head in shame and returned to the veranda. Sushil's friends, who had played with him just the previous evening, took one look at the grouchy old man and ran for their lives. They had no idea that it was Sushil himself. You'd remember, of course, that once upon a time Subal had told himself that if he ever got his lost childhood back, he'd lock himself up in his study and pore over his books all day long. He'd even give up listening to grandmother's stories and study in all earnestness. Now that he was young again, he hated the very thought of studying or going to school. Sushil was very angry with him and said, "Father, aren't you going to school today?" Subal looked down, scratched his head and said, "I can't. I've got a stomachache." "Stomachache, my foot," said Sushil angrily. "Don't try your tricks on me. I used to get similar stomachache to avoid going to school. Don't try to fool me. I know all about it." Sushil forced his young father to go to school. When Subal returned in the evening and longed to go out and play, it was time for old Sushil to wear his glasses and read the Ramayana aloud to himself. Subal's noisy presence disturbed him. So he made him sit in front of him and gave him sums to do. He selected such tough and complicated problems that it took his young father more than an hour to solve just one of them. Sushil was particularly careful about food. When his father Subal was an old man, he had a lot of digestive problems. The slightest overeating would bring on attack of acidity. Sushil remembered it very well and stopped his young father from eating his fill. Subal, on the contrary, was perpetually hungry these days and felt he'd even be able to digest a piece of stone. However, Sushil just would not allow him to eat normally, and Subal remained hungry. He started losing weight and grew thin. Sushil was afraid that he was really ill and made him swallow all kinds of pills and powders. Old Sushil also had his own problems. He soon realized that nothing of what used to be second nature suited him anymore. Earlier, he had been so fond of plays that whenever he heard of one being performed, he'd land up there. But when he tried to do the same now, he fell sick. Young Sushil had loved to take his daily dip in the pond. But the moment he tried it now, his rheumatism increased so alarmingly that he had to see a doctor for 6 months. He now bathed at home in warm water, and that too on alternate days, and refused to let Subal bathe in the pond as well. On some days, he would forget that now he was as old as his father and try his usual naughty tricks, such as throwing pebbles at old Aunt Anandi's picture and have the entire neighborhood jeering at him for his childish behavior. Subal too forget at times that he was no longer old. He would go and join the gathering of the old people and comment on their discussions. Needless to say, it would annoy them much. They'd box his ears, scold him for being precocious, and tell him to go away. Forgetting that he didn't look old any longer, he'd ask his tutor for a puff of tobacco. The tutor caned him soundly and made him stand on one leg as a punishment for impertinence. Sometimes he would go and smack Sushil as before. The elderly Sushil would flare up and say, "Is this kind of manners they are teaching you in school these days? How dare you?" People would rush in from all sides to defend Sushil and make Subal's life miserable with cutting remarks. Some even hit back. Enough was, after all, enough. Subal now prayed with all his heart that he might regain his lost age and independence, which he had been foolish enough to pass on to Sushil. Sushil too prayed earnestly that he might become young once again and play around with his friends the way he used to. "Father has become exceedingly naughty. I can't look after him anymore. He really worries me all day." The goddess who grants wishes heard them both. "Well," she said, appearing before them, "are you satisfied?" Yes, indeed we are," cried both father and son, falling at her feet. "Please change us back to what we used to be once again." "Very well then," said the goddess. "That's what will happen when you wake up tomorrow morning."